my wife of 38 years was locked in our own basement. I came home from a fishing trip expecting cold, sweet tea and the smell of whatever Carol had been cooking. And instead, I found the back door standing open, and silence so complete it pressed against my ears. 3 days she'd been down there. 3 days while I was casting lines on Lake Cumberland with men I'd known since high school. By the time I found her, she could barely lift her head off the concrete floor. My son-in-law did it, and the moment my daughter told me he'd done it to force my hand on a property deal, I made a decision as precise and final as any load calculation I'd ever drawn up in 40 years of building things. I was going to take apart everything he'd constructed, every piece of it, down to the foundation. It started the way most disasters do. Quietly, over coffee, with someone smiling too wide. Derek had been pushing the lake house issue for 2 years. The property sat on a 40-foot bluff above Barren River Lake in southern Kentucky. 11 acres. A 4-bedroom house I'd built myself in 1998, board by board on weekends while I ran my contracting business during the week. Carol and I had planned to retire there. We used it summers and fell back on the memory of it through every hard winter. Derek wanted his name on the deed. The pitch changed each time. First, it was about family investment. Then it was about tax advantages he'd read about online. Then it was about security, about what would happen to Melissa if something happened to me. I listened to each version the way I used to listen to subcontractors explain why a concrete pour had failed, patient on the outside, already calculating on the inside. The last time he brought it up was a Thursday evening in March. He and my daughter arrived at our house in Nashville without calling ahead. Melissa looked at the floor when she walked in. Derek looked at the ceiling, hands in his pockets, the way a man does when he's rehearsed something. Carol made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and let him talk. The property was worth somewhere around $300,000, he said. If they were ever going to build equity, they needed a foundation asset. Their rent was killing them. His freelance work had been slow. If I just added both their names to the deed, he could use the property as collateral, get a business loan, turn things around. I asked him what business. He said something about consulting. Gave me the name of a company I'd never heard of. I excused myself, walked to my office, came back 3 minutes later with a manila folder. I'd been keeping records since our first loan. February 2 years prior, $22,000 toward a down payment on a house they never closed on. December of that same year, $11,000 for Derek's truck, title in his name, loan agreement signed and never honored. 8 months ago, $8,000 for Melissa's medical bills after Derek's job dropped their insurance. 6 months ago, $4,000 described as temporary. For rent they'd fallen behind on, $45,000. Every transfer documented. Not a single payment returned. Not a single acknowledgement that the money was anything other than their due. I laid the papers on the table in a row, the way I used to lay out blueprints. "I'm not putting your name on my property," I said. Derek's jaw tightened. Carol watched him from across the table. Melissa finally looked up. "Dad, we're not asking you to give it to us. It's just security." "Security for whom?" I said. I looked at her steadily. "I've already given you more security than most parents give their children. That property is what Carol and I have. It stays as it is." Derek pushed his chair back. He stood up slowly, and something shifted in his face. Something I hadn't seen before. A hardness that made me understand suddenly that the smiling and the pitching had always been performance. "You know what your problem is," he said. "You can't stand to see someone else win." I told him to leave my house. He did, but he took his time doing it. Melissa followed, not looking at me. At the door, Derek turned back. "Think it over," he said. "We'll check back in." I stood in the doorway and watched their car back out of my driveway. Then I walked back inside and sat with Carol at the kitchen table until nearly 11, talking through every version of what that conversation might mean going forward. She'd seen the look on his face, too. We both knew something had changed. 4 days later, I drove to Bowling Green to meet 3 old friends for a long weekend of fishing on Lake Cumberland. I'd been planning it since January. I kissed Carol at the door, told her I'd call that evening, and backed out of the same driveway Derek had backed out of less than a week before. I called her Thursday night. She answered, sounded fine, asked how the fish were running. I texted her Friday morning. She replied within 10 minutes. Coffee's on. Missing you already. I texted again Friday evening. No reply. I told myself she'd gone to bed early. Carol sometimes did that. Lights out by 8:30 when she had the house to herself. Saturday morning. Nothing. I tried calling twice. Straight to voicemail. By Saturday afternoon, the feeling in my chest had moved from mild concern to something I'd only felt twice before in my life, both times just before something structural failed on a job site. A low vibration that didn't match any specific fact but was never wrong. I told the guys I needed to head back, packed my truck in 20 minutes, and drove the 3 hours back to Nashville without stopping. I turned onto our street at 4:15. Everything looked ordinary from the end of the block. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the Saturday paper still rubber-banded in the grass. Carol always brought it in before 8. I noticed her car hadn't moved. I noticed the garden hose was still unwound from Thursday, lying across the walkway where she'd left it after watering her tomatoes. I got out of the truck and walked quickly to the back door, which was unlocked. I called her name. Nothing. I went through the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom, the bathroom. Her phone charger was plugged in beside the bed. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand next to a library book she'd been 60 pages into. Her coffee cup from Thursday morning was still in the sink. Residue dried brown at the bottom. The basement door was closed. We kept it closed in summer because of the humidity. But when I tried the handle, it didn't give. The deadbolt was turned from outside. I had installed that deadbolt myself 14 years ago, after someone had broken into the neighbor's house through a basement window. It locked with a key from the outside and a thumb turn from inside. But the thumb turn required that the interior hardware hadn't been removed. I'd replaced the mechanism 2 years ago during a renovation and had never reinstalled the interior turn. It had been on my to-do list ever since. The key was on my keyring. My hands shook on the first try. I got it on the second. The door swung open, and the smell hit me before my eyes adjusted to the dim light. Heat, and something else. I recognized immediately from job sites in summer the smell of a body in distress. Carol was on the floor at the base of the stairs, propped against the wall, knees drawn up. Her face was streaked with dried tears and dust. Her lips were badly cracked. She was conscious, but only barely, eyes tracking toward me with tremendous effort. I dropped beside her on the concrete. I said her name, the way you say someone's name when you're not sure they can hear you. Ray. Her voice was barely sound at all, just breath shaped into a word. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 before I'd moved another inch. I described the situation in the clearest terms I had. Severe dehydration, 3 days without water, conscious but unresponsive to full commands. I gave our address twice. Then I held her hand and told her I was there and she was going to be fine. And I meant both things with the absolute certainty I'd learned over 63 years to reserve only for things I was completely certain of. While I waited, I gave her water from my truck thermos in small sips, the way a man does when he knows the body can only take so much at once. She held my hand and didn't speak. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. In the ambulance, between the oxygen monitor readings and the IV line going into her arm, I held her other hand and listened to what she could manage in fragments. Derek had come Friday morning. She'd been in the basement getting canning jars from the storage shelves. She'd heard footsteps on the stairs and turned around, and Derek was standing there. He told her to stay put until I called him. He took her phone out of her sweater pocket, told her the door would stay locked until I agreed to the deed transfer. Then he'd climbed the stairs, and she'd heard the deadbolt click. The basement had no water source. There was a half-empty bottle of sparkling water on the storage shelf from a party the previous fall. She'd made it last 2 days. The windows were set with security bars I'd installed myself. Steel rod frames bolted into the masonry. She'd used a paint scraper handle to knock against the bars for hours before her arm gave out. She was 61 years old. She had mild hypertension and a doctor's standing recommendation to avoid extreme heat. The basement in summer held at 90 degrees by mid-afternoon. The paramedic who rode with us was named Flores. At one point, he looked at me and said, quietly, that another 24 hours and we'd be having a very different conversation. I already knew that. I'd been doing the math since the moment I found her. At Vanderbilt Medical Center, Dr. Anita Sharma assessed Carol within 15 minutes of our arrival. Stage 2 dehydration. Contusions on both forearms from repeated impact against the door and the window bars. Early signs of heat-related stress. She was being admitted for IV rehydration and monitoring. At her age, with her blood pressure history, we needed to watch for complications. I sat with Carol until she slept. Then I kissed her forehead and told the nurse I'd be back in the morning. I drove home, walked directly to the basement, and spent 45 minutes photographing everything. The door mechanism, the interior side showing no thumb-turn hardware, the window bars, the marks on the floor and walls, the empty sparkling water bottle, the dried tears on the concrete, a detail I documented because I knew it would matter. I recorded the temperature on my phone thermometer, 91 degrees at 6:30 in the evening. I created a folder. I labeled it with the date and left nothing out. Then I drove to the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department and asked for the Violent Crimes Unit. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Sandra Pruitt. Late 40s, steady eyes. The kind of unhurried manner that means someone is actually listening to every word. She let me finish before she asked a single question. Then she asked very good ones. When I showed her the photographs, she studied each one without commentary. When I showed her the loan documentation, she studied that too. This is elder abuse, she said. Tennessee statute. 40 years serious. False imprisonment. In addition, based on what you're describing and what you've documented, I can get a warrant by morning. She followed me back to the house in her department vehicle. She photographed everything I'd photographed and more. She measured the window bars and the door clearance. She tested the deadbolt mechanism and documented that no interior release was possible. She noted the temperature. Our neighbor across the alley, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Hadley, had a security camera mounted above her back gate aimed at her driveway. She answered the door in her housecoat at 9:30 and pulled up the footage, without hesitation, on her kitchen laptop. Clear timestamp. Friday, 9:14 a.m. Derek's gray pickup pulling behind our house to the alley gate. 9:17. Entering our yard through the back gate. 9:41. Leaving. Driving away without any urgency. Detective Pruitt transferred the footage to her own device. Then she looked at me and said, "We have what we need." She left around 11. I sat in my living room in the dark. There were 8 missed calls on my phone from Derek, going back to Friday evening. 6 texts. Most of them said some version of "call me when you can." The last one, sent Saturday at noon, said "it's important, please respond." He'd been calling while Carol was on the basement floor. Whether he was checking on her condition or checking whether I'd come home, I was past caring about the distinction. At 11:42 he called again. I let it ring twice, then answered. His voice came in fast, the way people talk when they've been rehearsing and are trying to stay ahead of their own nerves. He said he just wanted to explain. He said it wasn't supposed to go this long. He said he'd planned for it to be a few hours, just enough to make me see they were serious. He said he hadn't realized how long the fishing trip was. I said nothing. He said it was a mistake, that he panicked, that Melissa had no idea he was going to do it. I kept quiet. His voice shifted. He said he was sorry, that he'd do anything to make it right, that he'd sign whatever I needed, agree to whatever conditions. He just needed me to not call the police. Too late for that, I said. Detective Pruitt has your security camera footage. She has my documentation. She has Carol's medical records. She's applying for a warrant right now. Silence. You need to understand what you did, I said. The doctor told me another day, and Carol would likely have died. You locked a 61-year-old woman with blood pressure problems in a 90-degree basement for 3 days. That's not a mistake. That's a choice made calmly, and then left in place for 72 hours. Dad, please. His voice cracked. Don't call me that. You lost the right. I ended the call. He called back 4 times. I watched the screen each time and did nothing. Then I blocked the number and went to bed. I didn't sleep well, but I slept. In the morning I visited Carol first. Brought her the flowers from the hospital gift shop because it was the only place open at 7 a.m. She looked better. Color coming back. Eyes focused. She held my hand while the IV dripped and asked me if I'd called the police. I told her everything I'd done and everything I planned to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Finish it." I met with an attorney named William Cross at 9 o'clock Monday morning. His office was on Church Street, 12th floor, view of the Cumberland River. He was 60, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd built his practice on outcomes rather than impressions. I laid out the situation completely. He took notes in a precise hand and asked clarifying questions at precise intervals. When I finished, he stood up and drew 3 columns on the whiteboard behind his desk. Criminal, civil, estate. Criminal was already in motion. Detective Pruitt's work. My role was to support with documentation and testimony. Civil suit. False imprisonment. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Elder abuse damages. He recommended filing for $200,000 given the medical costs and the severity. Estate. Revise immediately. I told him to start with the estate. His paralegal had the new documents ready by 11 o'clock that morning. The terms were simple. Carol received everything. If she predeceased me, my assets were distributed in equal portions to 3 charitable organizations: the Nashville Rescue Mission, the Vanderbilt Cancer Research Fund, and a scholarship at the trade school, where I'd gotten my first certification at 19 years old. My daughter Melissa received $1. My son-in-law Derek received nothing, not $1, because he had already taken enough and the estate would not become another instrument of his taking. The language Cross drafted was careful and explicit. I am intentionally and with full deliberation making minimal provision for my daughter Melissa Henderson, as she participated in and permitted an act that placed her mother's life in direct danger and has demonstrated a pattern of allowing her spouse's demands to override her obligations to her family. I signed on the last page. Cross's assistant and an associate witnessed it. Cross notarized with his seal. The original will, the one that had left Melissa 30% of everything I'd built across 4 decades, went into the shredder built into the credenza beside his desk. The sound it made was something I will remember. That afternoon, Cross's investigator delivered a preliminary report. Derek's employment history. 3 jobs in 6 years, each ending in termination or resignation under circumstances the investigator described as worth examining. 2 prior civil judgments against him in Georgia, both for unpaid debts. 1 dismissed fraud complaint from a former business partner. A credit score of 492. Total debt load, $41,000. Melissa's finances were entirely intertwined with his. Her own credit was functional until 3 years ago, when the shared accounts had dragged it down. Cross looked at the report and then looked at me. "They came to you for the lake house because every other door was closed," he said. "You were the last option." I thought about the way Derek had stood in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets. The rehearsed speech. The timing. Waiting until I had a fishing trip planned. I thought about Melissa not meeting my eyes when she walked in. She knew what he was going to do, I said. Cross folded his hands on the desk. "That may be difficult to prove criminally, but it affects the civil exposure." "She knew," I said again. He nodded. "We'll document it." Detective Pruitt arrested Derek on Tuesday at 11 a.m. She called me personally to inform me, which I appreciated. The charges were false imprisonment, a Class D felony under Tennessee statute, and criminal abuse of an adult, a Class B misdemeanor with enhanced penalties given the severity. Bond was set at $15,000. Arraignment was scheduled for Thursday morning. I was at the arraignment. Derek arrived in a suit that belonged to someone taller. His face had changed in the 4 days since I'd last seen it at my kitchen table. The confidence had gone out of it completely. He sat at the defense table with a young public defender and kept his eyes forward. Melissa sat in the gallery on the opposite side from me. She was wearing dark clothes and had not done her makeup. She saw me when she came in. We looked at each other for 3 full seconds. Then she turned away. The assistant district attorney, a methodical man named Harrison, laid out the state's case with the economy of someone who knew the evidence was complete. He read Carol's sworn statement. He presented the medical records. He showed Detective Pruitt's photographs, the door mechanism, the window bars, the concrete floor with its visible traces of Carol's 3 days there. He played the security camera footage. On the courtroom monitor, Derek's gray truck appeared at 9:14, and the jury of this small moment watched him enter my yard and come out 24 minutes later. The timestamp was merciless. Derek's attorney offered no credible counter. The best he managed was that his client had not intended the situation to last as long as it did, which was not a defense under the statutes in question. The judge, a careful woman named Honorable Claire Patterson, noted that intent to imprison for any duration satisfied the first charge, and that the medical evidence established harm beyond any threshold required for the second. She bound him over for trial. Date set for 60 days out. As we exited the courtroom, Cross walked beside me. He said, quietly, "The civil suit was filed this morning. Derek will be served by end of day." In the hallway, Melissa was waiting. She stepped toward me. "Dad," she said. I stopped. I didn't know he was going to do it. She said it quickly, needing it said before anything else. I didn't know. I looked at her. I thought about everything I knew. Every text exchange Cross had recovered between her and Derek in the days leading up to the fishing trip. A message from Derek on Wednesday saying, "I have a plan to get him to move on this." A message from Melissa saying, "Be careful. Not don't do it. Be careful." I thought about how she had not called me once in the 3 days her mother was on that floor. "Melissa," I said, "your mother almost died." Her eyes filled. "I know. You didn't call me." 3 days. Not once. I didn't know it had gone that long. I thought it was just going to be a few hours. I thought he'd let her out and call you and it would be over. "You thought he was going to lock your mother in a basement for a few hours," I said, "to extort a property deed from me, and that was acceptable to you." Her chin trembled. "I'm not angry at you in the way you might expect," I said. "I'm simply finished. Whatever your reasons were, whatever hold he has on you, you made a choice. Your mother could have died because of that choice. We're done." I walked past her toward the elevator. She said my name once. I kept walking. That evening my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. The area code was Georgia. The woman who spoke identified herself as Derek's mother. Her voice was tight with the effort of composure. She said she understood there were legal matters involved, but that she hoped we could resolve things between families before anyone's future was permanently damaged. I told her Derek had permanently damaged things on his own the moment he turned a deadbolt and walked away. She said he was a good man who had made a terrible error in judgment. I told her that a good man does not lock a 61-year-old woman in a basement and leave her there for 3 days. Whatever word she wanted to use for what Derek was, good man wasn't one I'd accept. She said she would pay back whatever money we'd given them over the years. She said she'd make sure of it. I told her this was not about money. It hadn't been about money since the moment Carol told me what happened from her hospital bed. She started to say something else, and I told her gently that this conversation wasn't going to change anything and that she should speak to her son's attorney. Then I ended the call. The civil suit was scheduled for a hearing in 6 weeks. In the meantime, Cross received a message from Derek's public defender suggesting a settlement meeting. They had no liquid assets, the defender explained. No savings, no property. The judgment wouldn't be collectible. Cross told me the same thing the investigator had told him. They're hoping you'll settle for something nominal with conditions attached. An admission of liability is worth more to us than a judgment we can't collect. What conditions? I asked. Full written admission of responsibility. Permanent waiver of any legal claim against you or your property. Agreed termination of any remaining marital connections to your estate. And formal apology, delivered in writing under oath. I told him to tell them we'd hear the offer. 3 weeks before the criminal trial, Derek's attorney approached the district attorney's office about a plea agreement. Cross kept me informed through his contacts in the DA's office. The state was willing to offer guilty plea to the false imprisonment charge, which carried a felony record, 2 years supervised probation, 150 hours of community service, mandatory completion of a batterer intervention program, because the psychological profile of the crime fit that category, and a permanent no-contact order covering both Carol and me. The district attorney's office consulted with me before accepting. I said yes. On the morning of what would have been the criminal trial, I arrived at the courthouse instead for the plea hearing. Carol came with me. She wore the blue dress she'd worn to our daughter's wedding, which I noticed and said nothing about. Derek was already in the courtroom with his attorney when we arrived. Melissa sat in the gallery. She looked as though she hadn't slept properly in weeks, which I suspected was true. Judge Patterson read the terms of the plea into the record. She asked Derek if he understood. He said, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice that had nothing left in it. She asked if he was entering the plea freely and voluntarily. He said yes. She asked if he understood the probation conditions and the permanent no-contact order. "Yes, Your Honor." She accepted the plea. She signed the sentencing order. The gavel came down. I watched Derek throughout. When the judge read the conditions aloud, his shoulders dropped slightly, the last of whatever posture he'd been maintaining releasing. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Carol. He stared at the table in front of him until it was over. Civil settlement followed in the same building 90 minutes later in a smaller courtroom. Derek and Melissa arrived together. Their attorney presented the settlement terms to Judge Carlos Mendez, a steady man who read every line twice. Full written admission of liability signed under oath. Permanent waiver of all claims against my estate and the lake house property. Agreement not to contact, approach, or communicate with Carol or me in any form. And a formal apology, also signed and witnessed. The admission was the part that mattered to me. Explicit. Specific. No softening language. On the date in question, I, Derek Wayne Henderson, deliberately imprisoned Carol Ann Mercer, age 61, in the basement of her private residence by means of an exterior deadbolt lock. I did so with the intent to coerce her husband, Raymond Mercer, into a property transfer against his will. I was aware that the space had no water source, no bathroom access, and no means of communication or egress. I accept full and sole legal responsibility for this action and its consequences. Melissa signed a companion document acknowledging her prior knowledge of her husband's plan and her failure to prevent harm to her mother. The judge signed the settlement order. Court adjourned. In the hallway afterward, Cross shook my hand. "That's it," he said. Both matters resolved. I found Carol standing near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the street. I walked over and stood beside her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Are you finished?" I thought about everything I'd set in motion over the past 9 weeks. The arrest, the warrant, the new will, the civil suit, the plea deal, the admission, every legal mechanism I'd found and engaged and let run to its conclusion. 40 years of working in a field where a single miscalculation could bring a building down had taught me something about thoroughness. "Yes," I said. "I'm finished." She took my hand. "We should go get lunch." We walked out of the courthouse in the September sunlight and down the steps to the street, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the Saturday afternoon I'd turned onto our street and seen the unread newspaper lying in the grass. I felt the particular calm of a completed project. Every load bearing, every joint secure, every account balanced to the last entry. Lunch was at a diner on Charlotte Avenue that Carol had always preferred, a place we'd been going to since before Melissa was born. We sat in the same booth we always chose, by the window, and ordered the same things we always ordered. The server, a young woman who'd been there for 2 years, asked Carol how her summer had been. Carol said it had been eventful, but that things were better now. We ate and talked about ordinary things. The garden, which had gotten ahead of itself while Carol was in the hospital, and then again during the weeks of legal proceedings. The boat that needed a new motor before we could get back on the water. A road trip we'd been discussing since spring, nothing planned yet, just the idea of it, heading west through the fall colors. We didn't mention the courthouse. We didn't mention Derek. We didn't mention Melissa. There are things you carry for a long time without knowing you're carrying them, and you only understand their weight when you set them down. I'd spent 38 years building a life with Carol, and part of what I'd been carrying, without naming it, was the accumulation of every compromise I'd made to keep the peace within a family that had been asking more of me than it returned. The afternoon light came through the diner window and Carol was across from me, telling me she thought we should repaint the kitchen a different color this fall, and I understood that this was what I'd been protecting all along. Not property, not principles. This. The diner booth. The afternoon light. The woman who'd spent 3 days on a concrete floor and come out the other side asking me if I was finished and then suggesting we get lunch. I drove home, opened my office drawer, and pulled out the manila folder where I'd kept every document from the case. I filed it in the cabinet behind the desk under a label that said closed, with the date. Then I locked the cabinet, put the key in the drawer, and went to find Carol in the garden, where she was already assessing the damage to the tomatoes and making plans.